Friends, I felt it high time for the return of both the jacket as well as the pocket square, but not for the obvious reason of this. This, a very flash British GT, or the fact that this, the DB11, is the first all-new Aston Martin since something like Elizabeth Regina's Silver Jubilee. No, I busted out the jacket and the pocket square to celebrate the fact that I am wearing shoes. I am well aware that this is shocking news for most of you. I'm also well aware that most of you feel I don't own a pair of shoes. Nothing could be further from the truth because I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit I'm a bit of a shoe guy and probably have too many pairs of shoes. But I busted out the shoes to kick off this tech review a bit differently. Rather than diving right into the engine, we'll get to it, but rather than going to that first, we're going to kick this off with a riddle, and the riddle is this. What does the DB11 have in common with these wingtips that were made by the fine folks of Allen Edmonds in beautiful Wisconsin, USA? Now, technically, you could answer the car and the shoes are handmade. Yes, that would be correct, but that's not the answer I'm looking for. I'll give you a second to sort it out. I'll open the door while you're doing that, and yes, that's a bit of a hint. Ready? If you were to say that the design of these wingtips, or just wingtips in general, impacted the design of the interior of the DB11, you would be correct. Now, I don't know when exactly these were designed. I think it was like in the 1800s, and I don't know who the original designer was, and they certainly probably didn't call that pattern brogue. But Aston Martin, they call that pattern brogue inside of a DB11. Now, but wait, there's more. It's not just the pattern itself. Look at the specific color. Somewhat of a fortuitous event. Notice I'm not stepping on the seat here. It's not just the color of the shoe in the seat. It's also the trim, that red trim inside the brogue pattern in the seat picks up my shoelaces. Now, if you followed me on Instagram, you knew that there was a choice of colors that we could have shot this car. Aren't you glad you chose this one? Now, the first thing you notice is the hood, so I want to point out three things. Yes, I am a complete design nerd. And number two, no, the fact that I am a design nerd has nothing to do with the fact that I am a total sucker for clamshell hoods. Just look at it. Remember how the hood used to open in a DB9? And the number three, yes, cool design, but this has more to do with the construction of the overall vehicle, which we will spend some time unpacking in the full first drive review with Kumo, so make sure you come back for that. For now, let's put a pin in this and let's focus on the engine. This one was final inspection by Ahmed Munir, so thank you, Ahmed, for sorting that out for us. The first thing you notice, this is no longer a 5.9 liter 60-degree V12. It is now a 5.2 liter 60-degree V12. And to make up for the lack of displacement, two turbochargers have been strapped to it. So yes, even at Aston Martin, turbochargers are now the reality. And the first thing you notice when you open up the hood, besides this usual Aston Martin brace here, are these two huge air boxes here that feed the turbochargers. That kind of tells you something else different is going on there. It's not the usual like air-to-air intercooler, it's a water-to-air charge cooler. So what does all this translate to in terms of output? Well, it's 600 horsepower, and that comes in at 6,500 RPM. The torque, 516, comes in at a very low 1,500 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 5,000 RPM. Now, when you think of a V12, pinnacle of efficiency is not the first thing that comes to mind, and frankly, I'm surprised these things are still around. Granted, I don't want them to ever go anywhere, but when you consider the tree-hugging militia out there, the social justice warriors that have it in for things like this, there needs to be some sort of like update to efficiency. So Andy Palmer and his group of merry engineers have come up with a unique solution, and that is cylinder deactivation. Now, that doesn't sound that unique, but how this goes about it is unique. So you think about like a V8, what it usually does is it lops off 4 cylinders. Here, it lops off one bank, but it doesn't just stay on one bank. It alternates between each bank every 20 seconds, and it does this to keep the catalytic converters warm to keep pinnacle efficiency. If that is not cool, I do not know what is. Anyway, let's put that aside. Do you remember the Rapide? That was the first Aston Martin that we drove with that new ZF Transaxle. This is fitted with the same thing. Now, the fact that it is a Transaxle in the rear does allow for Aston Martin to make what they call a front mid-engine car. All their cars are like this. And basically what that is the engine is either at or behind the front axle. But here they changed the overall structure of the vehicle, which enabled the engineers to push the engine even further back. Granted, it's only 65 mils, but remember how a similar trick in the transition from 997 to 991, by moving that engine an inch forward, the impact it had on driving dynamics. Something you and I are going to have to check out when we drive this thing together. Okay, let's put aside the engine, back to another party trick. So you know how like Bentleys and Maybachs and even other luxury cars have like the soft closing doors? Well, this is not fitted with soft closing doors. Instead, check this out. Totally cool. Okay, driving dynamics. What are you doing here? You never come out for the tech reviews. So a little bit behind the scenes here. He is the one that does all the research on the show, so by the time I get to the tech review, he is bored to tears with the bullets and numbers, so he just comes out for the full first drive review. But I would argue, he says he's Mr. Impartial when it comes to cars, but I would argue that this is irrefutable proof that these are his favorite cars, and I would also argue the color had something to do with it. With that, let's focus on the driving dynamics, and the biggest change is the structure. And to understand the difference here, we need to unpack the core of a Lotus, my beloved Lotus. So that is, and really any race car from like way back in the day, they are made out of an aluminum tub. And what makes up the aluminum tub is sheets of aluminum that has been folded like origami and then put together like Legos. They call it extrusions. And then they bond the rest of it together, so it's glued together. Well, every Aston Martin since Bill Clinton was president has been made with a similar method. They called it the vertical horizon platform, a vertical horizontal platform, some marketing mumbo jumbo. Anyway, here they have changed it. Instead of it being a tub, they still use the sheets of aluminum, they still fold it like origami, and it's still kind of put together almost like Legos, but instead of the gluing, there's more riveting that's going on. And what that changes, it favors the construction method to more stampings rather than the folding and the origami. So it looks almost like a more traditional car when it's naked. Now here's the thing. I have no idea why they did this. I've got an email out to Matthew Becker, and he's an old friend of the show, and he was the guy who ran vehicle attributes over at Lotus. Now he runs vehicle attributes for Aston Martin. What I want to do is I want to get him on the show, go over to Gaydon, see one of these things naked, and have him explain to us why they made these changes, because he knows everything in terms of this. Actually, he knows everything about cars, and he's an amazing drifter, believe it. He could probably give Vaughn Gittin Jr. a run for his money, no joke there. Okay, so now that we've unpacked that, what is hanging off the structure? In the front, it's double wishbones. In the rear, it's a multi-link unit. All the way around are adjustable dampers. But interesting, he's already bored with this. He doesn't like this stuff when I get into the suspension. Anyway, the adjustable dampers, Aston Martin, they take a very good decision here in that they separated the damper mapping from the throttle mapping. So one could drive the DB11 around with the stiffest damper setting, but have the most efficient engine setting around town, which is how I like to drive these cars when I have the option. Then let's focus on the brakes. It's 400 mils diameter in the front. What is that? That's almost 16 inches, 15.75. The back, 360, that's just a shade over 14 inches. And then the calipers, 4 piston in the back, 6 piston in the front. And to give you a basis of comparison, that 991.2 GTS we just drove, that's 350 in the front and 330 in the back. 20-inch wheels all the way around. But one important thing here, also basis of comparison I want to focus on here, is the size, the heft of this vehicle. This is a very large GT. And to give you an idea, DB9, that was what, 108-inch wheelbase. This is 110.1, a Bentley Continental GT, not exactly the smallest car in the world, also 108 inches. But here's the real interesting one. The 911, the one we just drove, that had a wheelbase of 96.5 inches. So this is over a foot longer in wheelbase than a 911. You don't get this until you see it in person. And then last but not least, this I love. Remember the SL63 we drove? This, like that car, has an old school mechanical limited slip differential. That's got to be Matthew at work. There's also like an active torque vectoring system in here, so not brake active, but really computers and doing all sorts of retarding the time, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that is everything we're going to cover in terms of driving dynamics here. There is 2 tricks, all relating to aerodynamics, that we're going to cover in the full first drive review. So he says make sure you come back for that. Now, let's get to another area that's been changed a lot, almost as much as that structure, and that is the business end of the car. And then there's this. And the best way to describe this is one word, and that is pageantry. Now, if you go back to the most recent Aston Martin episode, that was the Vantage V12. Amazing car. But the inside, like the structure, it was designed back when Bill Clinton was in office. So in fairness to Aston Martin, it never really kept up with competition. Yeah, they changed the infotainment system, but this is not light years ahead. This is galaxies ahead and leapfrogs the competition. And it's because of a couple of things. Yes, it's the textures we talked about before. There's some party tricks like this armrest. It opens with a touch of a button. Granted, I feel that will break over time, but wow, is it cool now. And then there are things like they changed the start procedure where you no longer have to put the emotional crystal in to start it. There's a regular start button. Oh, this one I believe is crystal. Then there's this odd shaped steering wheel. I don't know if I like it, need some more time with it. And then most importantly, this is the first visible fruits of the partnership with Daimler. If you've been under a rock for the past couple of years, Daimler owns 5% of Aston Martin. And so what you see here is switchgear from like an S-Class. But a little personal background here. Before I got into Lotus, I was this close to buying a TVR. And if you look at the switchgear inside of a TVR, it's either made from aluminum, very cool, or they take like bits from other cars, which is what makes that look like a kit car on the inside. This could have went that way, but not at all, because what they've done is they've taken what works, what looks good, but they've integrated it into their own design. Like, for example, the smart controller is like almost hidden within this leather valley here. And then more noticeable is the UX, the button controllers on the steering wheel, is like any other Mercedes, but Aston Martin has created their own buttons to work within the Daimler infotainment environment. And then last but not least, one thing I don't like about Mercedes is, yeah, they've got these TFT screens like everybody does nowadays. But in a car like that, I feel like, don't go the cheap route. I want to see some pageantry in the gauges. So BMW, of all people, they've been putting the bezels in here. And here, like a 911 or a BMW front and center, you see this beautiful bezel here. You know what? I don't normally say this, but bravo, Aston Martin. You guys did an amazing job on the interior. With that, let's go back outside. Oh, you moved. Yes, I did forget that, didn't I? Okay, so the boss man just reminded me that I neglected to share with you the difference in the track width. In the front, it is 75 mils wider. In the rear, it is 43 mils wider. That will definitely have an impact on our full first drive review, so make sure you come back for that. In the interim, he and I have been having a debate. So I look at this, and it is unmistakably an Aston Martin to me. He looks at it, and he thinks it's a spaceship, and it looks like no other Aston Martin that has come before it. So that is our question to you. What do you think? Does it look unmistakably like an Aston Martin, or is it a totally new direction? And just tell us yes or no, but why or why not? And you know what, for good measure, do you like this design or not? Let us know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all in word, MotoManTV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, we want to leave you with 2 things. Number 1, YouTube has butchered the platform so badly for YouTubers big and small, we have to ask you to unsubscribe from us on YouTube, resubscribe, and click notifications. And then number 2, a fun fact. So we have been driving this thing around the west side of Los Angeles, the South Bay, and no one liked that i8. No one gives this a second look. The i8 was like the second coming of Christ. Well, we just went to lunch over here at In-N-Out in the Valley, and let's just say things are different in the Valley, because this practically parted the Red Seas of that parking lot, where it wasn't just the after-school crowd of kids that came up and said, what is this thing? It was their parents. So until we see you for the full first drive review, bis später.